I listened to it. It was very It was like 52 minutes.
Name. Welcome to St. Mary's College. My name is Arlene Montevecchio. I'm the director of the Center for Spirituality, and I'm delighted to welcome you all tonight to our first lecture in the Endowed Spring Lecture Series. You may know the center was founded in 1984 with generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross. This year, we are celebrating the 35th anniversary of the center and 175 years of the college. A number of sisters are here in the audience tonight, and they've been empowering women as leaders and responding to the signs of the times for a long time. So thank you. Tonight, I am pleased to welcome a distinguished scholar to kick off our lecture series. Dr. Andrew Prevot is an associate professor of theology at Boston College, a graduate of Colorado College and the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Prevot has published countless peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He is author of Theology and Race, Black and Womanist Traditions in the United States, and Thinking Prayer, Theology and Spirituality Amid the Crisis of Modernity, which won the 2016 College Theology Society's Best Book Award. Dr. Prevot also co-edited Anti-Blackness and Christian Ethics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew Prevot as he delivers his lecture, Christian Prayer in a Violent World.
Well, thank you very much, Arlene. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Arlene. Thank you, St. Mary's. It's really nice to be back here in South Bend after I spent upwards of 7 years here studying it across the street at Notre Dame. So it's a happy homecoming for me. As you see, the title of my lecture is Christian Prayer in a Violent World. And I take it that the violence of the world is not something I have to argue for. I will assume that we all are familiar with some of the ways in which our world has been and continues to be often a very violent place. And so the question that I'm trying to pose for us tonight is, what good might Christian prayer do in such a context, in such a world? And in order to get at that question, I want to begin by entertaining some objections. Because given the violence of the world, it might seem to us that Christian prayer is not a very promising way to respond. So we're going to begin with recounting some objections to prayer. And this whole part of the talk, I'll be playing a kind of devil's advocate against myself. But you can see here, this is a picture of Abraham's binding of Isaac. Abraham, the patriarch in the book of Genesis, is a very prayerful person. But it's through that prayerful relationship with God that he receives instructions from God to sacrifice his own son in a violent manner, and is prevented at the final moment, the penultimate moment, from doing so. But nevertheless, this becomes a kind of icon of how perhaps prayer could go wrong. The weaker version of an objection to prayer would be that it does nothing to prevent violence. That as much as you pray, that's actually not going to be effective. It's not going to change anything. There's a stronger claim, which is that prayer is actually instrumental to violence. The argument there would be it's not only not doing anything, in fact, it's making things worse. It somehow is a big part of the problem. And so I want to go through a few different, more specific ways that these objections might be formulated. One way to add some specificity here would be to suggest that praying in response to violence only adds insult to injury. So when one prays for an end to the violence from which one suffers, this prayer may often go unanswered. Beyond not working, this experience of prayer can amplify the pain, because now one is a victim not only of others' cruelty, but also of God's apparent indifference. So we see this in the case of the biblical figure of Job, who ultimately is a victim of the Satan character in the story, who's going after his possessions, his children, and then finally his own bodily health. And so Job is taken to a point of extreme suffering through the violence afflicted upon him by this satanic figure. But ultimately he takes his complaints to God and does not, in fact, receive a very satisfying answer. God ultimately comes along and says, were you there when I created the hippopotamus and the ostrich and all of these things? No? Then okay, then, quiet. Stifle yourself. I'm God, you are a lowly creature, you cannot understand my ways. And so we might consider this to be a case of some sort of consolation that God does at least answer Job. But the objector here would suggest, well, what's really going on is that Job is now a victim of God as well, because God is not actually really answering for the crimes that have been done. So this is the adding insult to injury argument. The normal phrase is comfort for the afflicted, but there may be a way to look at prayer as comforting those who are doing the afflicting. This is a very upsetting image of Catholic bishops standing side by side with Nazi officials. The fact is that violent people pray, and their prayer does not seem to deter their violent behavior. In fact, prayer may give violent people a false sense of inner sanctity, irrespective of their conduct. So the idea could be that, well, as long as I have Jesus in my heart, it doesn't really matter what I do. I have this relationship with God that does not have anything to do with my action. So consider the Christians who prayed with their backs turned to Auschwitz, as Johann Baptist Metz, the German Christian theologian, says. Metz calls for a new version of Christian theology that would be informed by a prayer that's willing to look at Auschwitz and all of the suffering that was there. But he laments the fact that that's not what Christian theology was doing in Germany during the time. The Christians were not praying with that consciousness of violence in mind. They were allowing their prayer to give them consolation even while they were complicit in what was going on in their society. Prayer can also be seen as a form of public insincerity. In the aftermath of violent events, we routinely receive promises of thoughts and prayers from our public officials. Thoughts and prayers, thoughts and prayers. It can start to become almost like a flip comment where people can then absolve themselves of any further responsibility. This pretense of compassion often substitutes for any meaningful action to prevent future violence or to redress the wrongs that have happened. Parkland survivors such as Delaney Tarr have had enough. And here I'll show a short video clip.
We've had enough of thoughts and prayers. We've had enough of, we're in your consideration. We're going to think about it. We're going to tell you how we feel because we support you so much, because we know that that is not true. If you supported us, you would have made a change long ago, and you would be making change now. So this is to every lawmaker out there. No longer can you take money from the NRA. No longer can you fly under the radar doing whatever it is that you want to do, because we are coming after you. We are coming after every single one of you and demanding that you take action, demanding that you make a change.
So you can see here how one could think that this appeal to thoughts and prayers is only helping people to create a more violent world and doing nothing to prevent it. So I think these objections are actually quite difficult to face. These are not easily dispatched. And so if I'm someone, and I am, who wants to offer Christian prayer as a good thing for people to do in this violent world, I have to find some way of addressing all of these different ways in which prayer might seem not only to be ineffective, but also to be instrumental to violence. Here's another one. It is possible to pray to a false god. Whether this takes the form of a graven object like a golden calf, or is simply a product of one's own thought or imagination. This possibility becomes all the more dangerous if one follows instructions received in prayer with the assumption that God is condoning some violent behavior or encouraging it. George W. Bush famously said, "I am driven with a mission from God. God would tell me, George, go and fight these terrorists in Afghanistan, and I did. And then God would tell me, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq, and I did." And here we can see a picture of George W. Bush with Rumsfeld and so on. That administration was a very violent administration. It started a war. It dropped bombs, and it killed many civilians. But these were people of prayer at the highest office, or at least they claimed to be. But we have, some photographic evidence. So experts estimate that upwards of 165,000 civilians have been killed in war-related violence in Iraq since the 2003 U.S. invasion. So George W. Bush, I'm not saying that his entire spirituality was idolatrous, but I do have some serious questions. If this is the result of his prayer life, what kind of God is he really worshiping? It's really difficult for us to be sure that we're praying to the true and living God and not to some figment of our imagination that's just serving our own agenda or selfish needs. So how can we have Christian prayer that avoids idolatry? All right, so I want to shift gears now toward the more positive side of my argument and to offer some reasons why Christian prayer may still be a very valuable thing even in the midst of such a violent world. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this image. This is a picture taken of some of the rosaries that were confiscated from asylum seekers at the U.S. border. So these people, migrants who are seeking asylum in the United States, were praying along the way as they took that arduous journey. Many of them are Catholic people praying the rosary. The preceding objections show that prayer not only does not stop violence in every case, but also sometimes abets it. Although these objections confirm St. Paul's point that we do not know how to pray as we ought, they do not justify a total renunciation of prayer, and for at least two reasons. And the first is sort of captured by this image here. Many who are suffering from violence have found strength and hope in prayer. And I think we need to take that point very seriously. If you're suffering from violence and prayer gives you some sort of hope or strength, who am I or who is anyone to try to take that away from you or say that you shouldn't pray as a response to your violent situation? Moreover, prayer has played a crucial role in the formation of some heroically nonviolent people. I also don't think we want to discount the ways that prayer sometimes helps people grow and develop and find courage to do active things in resistance against the violence of this world. So it's these 2 points that I really want to develop further. So let's think for a little while about the prayers of the victims. this practice of crying out from the depths. Are we to stand in judgment against those who cry out to God in lament or supplication? Lament is when you are complaining and basically saying, God, why is this happening to me? Why would you let this occur? Supplication is when you're making a request. God, please save me. Please rescue me from what's happening in my life. In words, silence, or screams, with fear, sadness, or anger, no decorum is required, and no emotion is off limits for such prayer. So prayer can be a place for the free expression of whatever feelings you have in the midst of this violent world. And that can take whatever mode of expression you want it to take. If that for you is just about remaining silent, then that could be perfectly fine. If it's about writing or speaking, that could be fine. If it's just about a sort of cry from the depths, a kind of literal cry, that could also be fine. When no one else will listen, one can still turn to God as a last resort. Sometimes I think that the decision or the freedom to decide not to pray is really a luxury. Many people in this world have nowhere else to turn but prayer as they're dealing with some of the daily realities of their lives. And one can do this in perfect imitation of the crucified Jesus, who cites the words of the psalmist, my God, why have you forsaken me? So this form of prayer that we might think is questioning God or fighting back against God is actually something that we see performed by Jesus himself and could be seen as really an act of discipleship, following in his footsteps. In the storm of transatlantic slavery, many black African slaves prayed and also longed for more time to pray, a fact poignantly expressed in the spiritual, I've been in the storm so long. It's another short video clip.
I've been in the storm so long. I've been in the storm so long, children. I've been in the storm so long. Oh, give me a little time to
So that just gives you a sense of that kind of power of prayer to express these great emotions of longing, grief, anguish, and the role that it might play in the lives of victims of violence. Now, sometimes the violence of the world can be so grave that it completely erodes one's relationship with God, perhaps even one's belief in God. It can become so crushing that the very idea of God ceases to be meaningful. But what I want to say, now citing the poet Paul Celan, is that even in such instances, there may be a form of prayer that's doing some work. Even if you don't have belief yet, there may still be a prayer that takes the form of a kind of lament into a God who may or may not exist. I want to just read the words of this poem he wrote called Psalm. Paul Celan, by the way, is a survivor of the Holocaust who wrote poetry reflecting on that experience. No one needs us again out of earth and clay. No one incants our dust. No one. Blessed art thou, no one. In thy sight would we bloom, in thy spite. A nothing we were, are now, and ever shall be. Blooming, the nothing, the no one's rose. With our pistol soul bright, our stam in heaven waste, our corona red from the purple word we sang, over, oh, over the thorn. What I want to point out here is that there's still a thou. This is still an address, but it's addressed to no one. So it's a sort of, it's a very painful reinterpretation of the Jewish tradition of prayer to the God who is the creator and redeemer. But I just think that even pushed to the limit, this is the kind of extreme case, prayer may still have some positive role for someone like Paul Celan, even in such an attenuated form. But prayer is not only about expressing violence when we're thinking about what it does for the victims. It also can bring comfort. It can bring a sense of peace or healing in a very violent and turbulent world. The closeness with God one can find in prayer may provide some comfort even in the midst of grave suffering. Moreover, praying with and for the afflicted can be a way to show solidarity and to practice compassion. So if someone is in the midst of suffering, to be willing to spend your time in prayer with such a person can be an act of love that brings you two together. When you know that people are suffering in your life, praying for them can be a way for you to train yourself to connect with what they're going through, to develop your sense of empathy, to develop closer bonds. I think about St. Teresa of Avila's Nada te turbe, one of the most consoling hymns sung here by a Taze choir. And I also think about the prayer-filled acts of solidarity by Taze communities around the world, especially through their Operation Hope program, which is a kind of humanitarian aid program. But this is just a map showing all of the different Taze communities that have participated in Operation Hope. And what these communities do in all of these parts of the world is they gather together for prayer, this kind of Taze chant, but they also then do works of service to help those who are suffering, whether from poverty or disease or war or whatever the case may be. And so there's a kind of beautiful integration of prayer, a life of prayer in community, with a caring for all of the needs of the members of that community. And so I think that prayer can really be a powerful source of comfort in the world. It can also inspire public witness. So we saw that there was this objection about public insincerity. But actually, there have been public figures, such as Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King Jr., whose practices of prayer strengthened them for transformative political struggle. In jail on a hunger strike in protest of the unjust treatment of suffragists who were being persecuted in their fight for women's right to vote, Day found herself in a pit of deep desolation. Though not a believer at the time, she turned to the Psalms for strength. And she says in her long loneliness, her autobiography, "I prayed and did not know that I prayed." So she was reading the Psalms in jail, in this pit of despair, but they were giving her some sort of strength to go on. And I don't think we would have the Dorothy Day that we know and love so much today without these kinds of prayerful experiences in her life. Similarly, in the days leading up to the Montgomery bus boycott, King received yet another death threat over the phone. Feeling afraid and discouraged, almost ready to quit, he went to the kitchen to pray. There he regained his strength, and as he says in his recollection of this Montgomery episode, which is called The Stride Toward Freedom, at that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced him before. And so he regains this power to do the work that he feels God is calling him to do in the world. So prayer can prepare one to be a powerful witness to Christ. and an active servant of his kingdom. Without it, would we have the Catholic worker movement? Would we have the civil rights movement? I'm not so sure. Now, I believe it is certainly possible for people who don't have active prayer lives to still do works of justice and mercy in the world and to be public witnesses to a transformative kind of social vision. So I'm not saying that prayer is necessary for absolutely every person's life. Nevertheless, I do want to maintain that if we're just looking at history, many of our greatest heroes in this regard have been prayerful people. And I don't think that that's pure coincidence. I think that their prayer is doing something for them to help them put themselves out there publicly in nonviolent resistance. This is also true in the case of someone like Oscar Romero, who for me is one of the clearest modern-day icons of what I would call true worship. So we thought about the worship of idols, but what would it look like to worship the true God? So St. Oscar Romero, defender of the poor, was assassinated while presiding at Mass in 1980. And you can see what his life was dedicated to. It's feeding the poor, feeding them with the material needs that they have, but also in a spiritual way. About prayer, this is what he wrote. How necessary in this difficult hour is a conscience docile to the Lord's truth. In this difficult hour, more than ever, is there a need for prayer, united with a genuine will to be converted. Prayer that out of intimacy with God cuts one off from the confused clamor of life's shallow experiences. A will to be converted that is not afraid to lose prestige or privilege, or to change a way of thinking when it is seen that Christ insists on a new way of thinking that is more in conformity with his gospel. So he spoke these words in the late 1970s when El Salvador was on a path towards civil war. So that's, when he says in this difficult hour, that's what he's referring to. But I think in our world right now and in our country right now, we could think about these words applying in a very similar way. You know, in the difficulties that we face, in the violence, in the midst of the violence that we see all around us, is there not, as Romero says, a need for prayer united with a genuine will to be converted, a genuine change of heart? I want now to shift gears and talk for a little bit about what prayer looks like in the age of Pope Francis, who you can see also has spent some time in prayer. I tried to collect as much photographic evidence of prayer as I could. So the title of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si comes from St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of Brother Sun, which is a hymn of praise through all created things. Praise be to you, that is Laudato Si, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. One of the interesting things about this Franciscan form of prayer that Pope Francis is picking up on is that it implies that prayer is not only something that human beings do, that in some ways the whole of creation can be seen as participating in a life of prayer, insofar as it's giving glory and praise to God. Amen. Thank you. The Pope argues, however, that creation's song of praise, as we could see in St. Francis's hymn, has been transformed into a cry of anguish. This sister, that is Mother Earth, now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. So there's also a sense in which creation not only praises God, but laments for Pope Francis. Also participates in this cry from the depths. Now, the Pope laments the problems, especially of pollution, water scarcity, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity. And although prayer informs the entire encyclical from beginning to end, and it ends actually with two beautiful prayers, that are worth incorporating into one's own spiritual practice if that's something you would be interested in doing. But it's also, prayer is only one part of Pope Francis's revolutionary vision for an integral ecology at every level of society: political, economic, technological, cultural, spiritual, and so on. So on the one hand, prayer is the inspiration for the whole thing, for the whole vision. On the other hand, Pope Francis is very far from saying that all we have to do to solve the ecological crisis is just spend a few hours at night praying to God about it. He says, no, we have to actually figure this out and work together collaboratively at all of these different levels of society. It's only through such an integral ecology that real change might come about. So prayer can help us to change our hearts, but we also need to change the structures of our society and the habits of our lives. A more controversial use of prayer can be found in Pope Francis's letter to the people of God, released August 20th of last year, after the Pennsylvania grand jury report detailing horrifying patterns of clerical sexual abuse. In his letter, Pope Francis invited the entire holy faithful people of God to a penitential exercise of prayer and fasting following the Lord's command. This could be an important collective practice if, as the Pope contends, it opens our eyes and hearts to other people's suffering. However, the absence of any comprehensive vision of radical social transformation and integral development on the precise issue of clerical sexual abuse and sexual violence more broadly makes this public appeal to prayer ring more hollow than the public appeal to prayer in Laudato Si, in my opinion. So we don't have something analogous yet to Pope Francis's account of integral ecology in response to the sexual abuse crisis. We don't have all of the pieces coming together. What he gave us in this letter was only that one piece of prayer and fasting, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing. But in order for that to seem to be a true public witness, it's going to need to be accompanied by meaningful action and vision. Now, I hope that the Rome Summit that began today will help to integrate such penitential prayer with meaningful action. So I hope that that's true. I am encouraged that survivors will be present at the summit, but we will also have to wait and see whether their voices and demands will really be heeded, because sometimes they are listened to, but then the same patterns continue. So what will really come of this summit? Will this practice of prayer become an instance of public insincerity or of true worship on the part of the Pope and Christians more broadly? I want us to spend a little bit of time now just listening to what some of the survivors have said about prayer and about Pope Francis.
I want my day in court. I want justice.
There's only one remedy for this, and that's to eliminate the SOL, the statute of limitations, and enact the survivor window. That's the only remedy. Prayers are what got us into this mess.
If you had an audience with the Pope, if you could sit down with him and speak to him face to face, what would you say?
I would say you need to clean up your act. You need to get your church in order. You need to take all of those priests that have been abusing children and put them in jail.
The way I feel now, prayers, penance, fasting, they're all words. I need action.
They're not listening to us. He is not listening to us. So I think if Pope Francis wanted to do something, maybe that would be a good place to start.
So how are we supposed to pray in this violent world? It seems kind of like a daunting thing because there seems to be so many ways for it to go wrong, and we're so accustomed to praying wrongly. And yet it also seems crucially important because it's something that the survivors and victims of violence are doing, and it's something that has empowered heroic resistors of violence throughout history. So I'm just going to give 4 points here to definitively answer this question for all time. No, these are my suggestions, and it's not a comprehensive list, but it is, I think, maybe a start. So number one, listen to the cries. Listen to the cries of the poor, the oppressed, and all of God's precious creatures who are suffering from violence. Let their words, silences, and screams, and their painful emotions pierce your heart each and every time that you pray. So when you pray, do not do it with your back turned toward whatever suffering or violence is happening around you. Let all of that come into your consciousness and into your own emotional makeup as you pray. So that kind of clip where you hear survivors talk about their experience of abuse, I think watching something like that, or remembering something like that could be a very important thing to do as a preparation for prayer. Number two, lay your soul bare, holding nothing back. Or as I put it here more poetically perhaps, come naked before God. Welcome both scrutiny and comfort from the divine source of all things, who made you and who summons you to a more radical commitment to others and more embodied fidelity to the gospel. Prayer is not a time for any kind of pretense, for any attempt to be something you're not. It's just a time to be yourself completely before God. To be the creature that is loved by God, and also to be the sinner who needs redemption before God. And to let yourself just be exposed to God's judgment and mercy simultaneously in as deep and full a way as possible. And I think that's how prayer can start to have a transformative impact on how you view yourself and your life. Never use prayer as an excuse not to act. That's never what it's supposed to be. So if you're ever doing that, or if anyone's ever doing that, that's a clear sign they're doing it wrongly. Use prayer to prepare yourself for action, to strengthen your resolve, to detach yourself from sinful desires, and to become, as Romero said, docile to the demands of true discipleship, solidarity, and nonviolent resistance. So prayer should be, at its best, a training ground for your will and your soul, so that when things get tough, you have those spiritual resources to draw upon to continue. Because things will get tough if you're fighting the violence of this world. And prayer can give you that strength, as it did for Dorothy Day, as it did for Martin Luther King. And finally, praise and glorify the divine liberator who desires to bring freedom and joy to every living creature. So I do think that prayer should not stop with mere lament or even petition, but should actually become an act of praise of the God who alone may have the power to transform the world in an absolute sense, to bring peace to what has been such a violent reality. So the way you glorify God is not only through your words, but also through your actions. So if you pray in these aforementioned ways, there's no reason to limit it to Sunday mornings or to a few spare minutes of the day, though setting aside such specific times is important, as is regular communal worship. So I'm not saying don't set aside time for it. I think you ought to. But don't limit it to such times. Cultivate a prayerful state of mind in every action and interaction in your daily life. Do not let prayer become compartmentalized from other things. Let it shape the way you live. Constancy in this sort of prayer is, I believe, the most promising path toward a less violent world. That could be debated, but that's really the position from which I'm speaking. Although praying wrongly has contributed to violence, I don't contest that even stronger claim in the objections, that prayer has been instrumental to violence. I just want to also point out, though, that mere prayerlessness has no better track record. So if we're being totally fair about it, we would also have to look at people who have no prayer life in history and consider in what ways that absence of prayer has been instrumental to their behavior. So I think that prayerfulness and prayerlessness, neither one will automatically get you a nonviolent life. But I don't think that prayerlessness in and of itself is any more promising. The question is how a new life-affirming energy and passion can break through cycles and structures of violence and create a better possible world. In the final analysis, true prayer is nothing but our active participation in this divine source of healing and transformation. So if we're praying rightly, what we're really doing, I think, is opening ourselves up to the action of God in history in response to violence. And all of the many subtle and small and powerful ways that God responds to violence. It's usually not meeting violence with more violence, by the way, although maybe it is in some very specific instances, but usually not. And so I think that's how I would really like to define prayer, ultimately, is actively participating in the liberating work of God and the world. So thanks. That's all I really have. Thank you. So I'm happy to field any questions or receive any comments. Yes.
Thank you for being here and your presentation. My question is, how did you come to this? What was it in your spiritual life, or growth, or journey, that made you embark upon examining, looking at prayer?
Thank you. That's a good question. When I was young, I was always a very sensitive kid. And especially as I grew in some self-awareness, I was afraid of the judgments of others, at school and so on. And I think that's where I could trace my prayer life to, thinking that I felt like I always had a sort of friend in God. And so maybe God was my first imaginary friend, in a sense. But as I came to face a world that I realized had more and more problems, I drew strength from that sort of relationship, that sense that there was a source of love greater than myself that really grounded me. And then there were various other experiences in my life that confirmed this for me. I spent a little bit of time in El Salvador and talked to a woman who had some children disappeared during the war. And she said that she prayed every day for her kids. And I just came back to the United States, to the university, and everyone was talking about prayer and spirituality and religion as if they were really backward and ignorant and stupid. And I thought, you're not listening to the people we need to be listening to and learning from their experiences, their way of dealing with life. So I could tell other stories like that, but it's those kinds of stories, talking to real people who pray and trying to really understand what are they doing in their prayer and why. But also being really upset by, for instance, George W. Bush's appeal to prayer and then going off and doing all of this violence. I mean, this has been a real existential conflict for me, too. So that's part of my own personal backstory. You're welcome. Yeah. Other questions? I can't see that well. Yes, right here.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what you think about the format of prayer, which you only touched on maybe a little bit. And it was the use of songs. You paid a lot of attention to hymns and songs that got me thinking about this. Are prayers that are moving towards nonviolence, is it better to be verbal or nonverbal, communal or private? I mean, can you just sort of talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all kind of thing there. I think, though, it's probably important to have some integration of those different elements. I could hardly imagine a life where it was only solitary prayer and there was never any sense of communal prayer, although maybe people have done that. But it seems to me that even when someone is enclosed in their cell to pray, there's a sense of the larger communion of those with whom they are offering prayers, even if they're not physically present. I think that silent prayer can be very helpful in terms of quieting all of the distractions in life and trying to gain some control over one's thoughts and one's breathing, get a sense of kind of meditative awareness of one's body. That can be really helpful. Sometimes, though, I think yelling is good because you need to get some stuff off your chest, and maybe God is going to have to just wait until you're done unloading. And so I don't have a lot of prescriptive points to make about the format of prayer, I suppose. I would rather emphasize a kind of freedom to pray in the way that's having the greatest impact on you in your life, or making the most sense for you at any given point in time, within certain limits, I suppose.
That's right. Have you thought about the practice of leaving out the violent parts, so-called violent parts of the Psalms? Should we use those? Sometimes in our liturgies we omit those in the liturgy of the hours. Have you thought about what we should do with those sections of violence in the Psalms?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I can't remember the number of the psalm, but the worst one is the bashing of the children. 137. Thank you. Against the rock. I'm not in favor of omitting them, and here's why. I think it would be better to think about the pain that the Israelites were in, such that this became part of their prayer life, but to also think about the pain that they would have caused had they actually followed through on this, and to think about the sinfulness of our habits, where we so often take suffering and turn it into a reason for violence, and to use it for some self-examination. You know, who are the people in my life that I want to bash against a rock? And where is that impulse coming from? I'm really against any attempt to sanitize prayer. I want it to be filled with a deep awareness of the reality of the world and all of its suffering and violence, but I don't want that to then be the result of prayer. So I think there needs to be some probably careful liturgical, catechetical work. I might be fine omitting it from the liturgy, from like a public worship where you can't be sure exactly how it's being received. But I would pray with a text like that and really sit with it.
Do you have any thoughts about swearing? You talked about crying and lamentation, but there's a lot of scatological language, very earthy.
Yeah. I think God can take it. I don't think God is like the FCC in the sky. I think prayer is one of the few places in the world where we can be really uncensored. Because who are we kidding if we think we're hiding anything from God? If a word like that crosses one's mind and one says, "Oh, I shouldn't say that to God," God knows it's there. I think sometimes prayer can feel like such an unfree thing, where you just have to follow the rules, but then I think it can't really do the transformative work that it's supposed to do. I think we have to be fully who we are in the midst of prayer in order to open ourselves to be changed and to grow. I don't know what to do, though, with the taking the Lord's name in vain. I suppose my asterisk on that would be, if you're talking to God, then it might be okay, but maybe not when you're talking to anyone else. And it wouldn't be in vain, per se, I guess, in that context. Other questions maybe from this side of the room? Or it doesn't have to be this side. Oh, okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm confused about like your view on like George Bush's prayer, because he's as sure of his God as you are of yours. And so like, how do you get into a position where you can examine your God from an outsider's perspective in order to ensure that it's not the idolatrous one?
Yeah, that's a really tough and good question. And really what I'm using as my criterion in many ways is a view of God as wanting us to be free of this violence, and not to commit it. And that's the only sort of God that really makes sense to me. It might be a figment of my imagination too. I don't think that I can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to a skeptic that that's the real and true God. I could say, well, I'm grounding it in Scripture and tradition, which is true, I am, but I'm also selectively reading those for the view of God that makes actually more sense to me than not. Because certainly there are examples of God doing violent things that one could find in Scripture. There's certainly appeals to a violent God in the tradition. So, but for me, idolatry and violence are very closely linked together. And I think that that's I associate God with the sort of love that is powerful enough not to be violent. So that's my own test, and I could still, but I don't think any of us can probably escape every form of idolatry in our prayer lives, but we just have to be trying to root it out of ourselves, I think, as we continue to pray. It's a good question.
I just have to say, as a theologian, you came across very simply and with clarity. And you weren't way up here. You spoke English. I could understand.
Well, thank you for that comment. Thank you all very much.
And
oh, sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
Sorry, I don't mean to.
No problem at all.
I just have a question. So, I'm over here.
Oh, sorry.
Hi. I just want to know, where do you put the line between fighting for justice for any group of people and putting this "we can pray" violence away? Where's the line?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Could you reframe it or rephrase it?
So we're talking about praying for no violence, for taking away violent behaviors of human beings. Violent as in bad for each person, or what do you do to fight against the bad people who are doing those horrible things to people who are praying for no violence?
Right. Okay, I think I understand. I think your question in some ways is about violence as a means of resistance. Is that part of what you're asking about? Is it okay at some point in this attempt to kind of have a prayerful way of life that's resisting violence, will that ever take on violent means against the perpetrators or against people who are causing the harm. I think it could, but as I said, I think that to me is a very, very last resort. I think we're too quick to go to that. I would love for us to seek more creative solutions to any given problem before doing anything that would be destructive to another person's body or psyche in any kind of way. I have a concept of justice that's focused more on restorative justice than retributive justice in mind. So justice meaning really a restoration of right relationships, healthy relationships between people, as opposed to a kind of tit for tat or an eye for an eye. And so I'm just really reluctant to recommend violence, although I think that there can be some justified forms of it. I don't want us to start with that, I suppose. I want us to seek out every possible peaceful response that we can. Thank you all very much.
Thank you again, Professor Prevot. This was an excellent lecture, and I just invite you to stay and enjoy refreshments. And please, on your way out,